I have a student in one of my classes who said, how do you do it? How do you do this every day and come to an institution where historically you're not welcome? And it's hard as a woman, as a queer person, as an ethnic minority to be in these spaces. And I think for me it comes from seeing them and being able to know that behind me are so many generations that are going to come and do so much good and make so much change, and that comes from them learning to use their own voices. So the more I use my voice, the more I feel like they will be able to use theirs, and so the legacy continues for me. The history of voting rights in America has been very long and very complex, for people who have studied gerrymandering, they know that it has come in bits and pieces. In general, I would say, groups of people by race have been included slowly over time, and that has its own set of implications to go with it. It means that people have been more or less likely to vote depending on how long they've been able to do the voting in the first place. I know for Indigenous populations, there's a lot of the feeling of disenfranchisement that has been a holdover for many, many years from being excluded from the right to vote. But then you do see it, like in the most recent election, the Navajo Nation moved out in enormous numbers to mobilize and to get their vote out.
Well, I agree with you, and I think it actually points up to me the importance of the midterm elections. As you're preparing for a presidential, because I don't think it's an accident that the Navajo Nation turned out in such high numbers, and of course in 2018, Deb Haaland was sent to Congress. So one of the things I think it shows is that even when there are efforts to restrict voting rights, that grassroots mobilizations that are very targeted, that really come from people inside the community and then are supported from people outside the community, can make a huge difference in changing the political landscape.
When you start studying politics or the history of voting and democracy, I think a lot of students, especially right now in the context of everything that's happening in the world, they enter in with a little bit of cynicism and a little bit of chip on their shoulder in terms of their perspective on what power is and who controls power, and I think that's fair. That's fair in this world and what we're seeing. But I think there is an assumption that this kind of control of power is very unique to the United States and is something that you see really in corrupt Western countries. It's sort of a rhetoric that goes along with that sort of thinking, and I think that is understandable but also unfair. As someone who's coming from an immigrant family and whose family fled actually, Marxist intervention in the country of Peru, those controls of power and the way that people try and seize power and hold it over others can be seen everywhere. That's everywhere and at any time, right? That's not just today. It's not a problem of right now. This is a problem of history. But it's also something that is universal and is something that you can see in every corner of the world. There isn't a single system that is going to preclude us from having issues of power control, unfortunately.
Right, and of course for many years, United States foreign policy supported dictatorships and autocrats in Latin and Central America.
Yes.
And so that really has a great deal to do with how autocracies have been shaped in this hemisphere. I think the other position I'm looking at it from is the internet and the ways in which the internet has made it possible for white supremacist networks and nationalist populist networks to connect to each other and create similar programs across national borders. And I think certainly we've seen that in Eastern Europe in the last 10 years. I think we've seen the influence that the election of Donald Trump had on strengthening autocracies, even in places that were more democratic. I mean, if you look at a country like Turkey, for example, Turkey has gone steadily right and become more nationalist, and dramatically so during the Trump administration.
And I think to bring it back to my own research as well, I think there are instances in which you can see now grassroots movements starting to expand, making use of infrastructure like international law in order to strengthen their own democratic efforts, right? I mean, there are Quichua women in Ecuador who are engaging in different levels of kind of sovereignty building in order to battle back autocratic demonstrations of power. So having those grassroots efforts grow and expand and rely on global rights standards is very helpful actually for democratic participation and health as well.
Yes, no, I agree with you completely. And one of the things I think about in terms of the last few years and how we have seen autocrats become strengthened alongside Donald Trump is spending, 6 weeks in Poland some years ago with the Center on Democracy and Diversity. And it was stunning to me how many young people were fighting at the grassroots for freedom of speech, for democracy, for LGBT rights. And it really spoke to me of the ways in which education and creating educational spaces for people to speak freely can then create networks that blossom into things that you can't know. You can't know how that's going to promote democracy down the line.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing that I try and discuss with other students and my colleagues at the UN, my own students in classes. Participation in democracy doesn't just look like voting, although voting is obviously a key indicator of health and is very important to do. There are so many ways to engage in a democratic practice, and how you do it is really rooted in where you come from and the community that you're in, and participating in that way can make an enormous difference.